Today's class will deal with the next set of laws in Parshat Mishpatim. We saw a description of the male slave, and now we have a description of the laws that apply to the female slave. Before reading the biblical text, I think it is important to remembering a few assumptions that we have to make about what society was like a little more than 3,000 years ago. And these are the assumptions that underlie the text that we're going to be reading. Assumption number one: a man has a right to marry off his daughter before the age of majority. And this was common throughout the ancient world, that a man would decide who it was who his daughter was going to marry, and generally she didn't have choice. In the halachic system, there's a kind of a chidush, a new element that's put into this decision, saying that once the daughter reaches the age of majority, she is allowed to opt out. That this isn't mentioned anywhere in the Torah, the concept that the rabbis called me'un, but the rabbis said, yes, this is true. As in all societies in the ancient world, a man has a right to marry off his daughter before she reaches the age of majority. And but the rabbis limited it a little bit by saying that she has the right to opt out if he does this. Another assumption, perhaps even more troubling: a man has a right to sell his daughter. That's how our text will begin today. In the next verse in Parshat Mishpatim, it begins. We'll read the verse in a second. Ki imkor ish et bito la'ama. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave. We talked about in previous sessions what the Torah envisioned when a man became a slave, what happened with his children. And some of the scholars of what the Bible is saying actually said that, of course, the family became slaves also. When a man became a slave, then halacha didn't say that. Again, it's an example of the rabbis limiting what would happen to family. But our text begins here with saying that a man has a right to sell his daughter as a slave. And I would argue that this was the standard understanding in all of the societies around the Israelites. And perhaps the last assumption that should be put on the table here is that women generally got married around puberty, or perhaps even a little bit before puberty. All of these assumptions, those of us living in 2022, looking at these assumptions, say, what kind of society is, this is so strange and so different from our understanding of the relationship between a father and a daughter, and the relationship of of marriage. But again, in the ancient world, it was understood that people generally got married around puberty. As I said, this is extremely strange for us to imagine something of this nature. There are some obvious advantages in people getting married around puberty, and when people begin to have sexual desires, then instead of being told that they should wait for 10 years in order to be able to do something about their sexual desires, in the ancient world, it was common that people who had not very long life expectancies, that is also possibly another reason why people got married much younger in the ancient world, and particularly women got married younger in the ancient world. I guess perhaps I should have written one other assumption that underlies this text here, and that is the assumption that a man can be married to more than one wife. This we'll see in some of the understandings of this text that we're going to be looking at, that assumption shows up also, and that a woman cannot be married to more than one man at the same time. Again, these are assumptions that trouble us today with our 21st century values, but this is kind of what the Torah had to deal with societal assumptions, and what the rabbis had to deal with when the rabbis were interpreting these texts. Okay, so those are the general assumptions that we have to remember as we are studying these texts. And now we go on to see what the texts have to say. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as male slaves do. You can see that both on the Hebrew side and on the English side, I highlighted in red 4 phrases, because these are what scholars would call the interpretive cruxes. These are the interpretive questions about which there is much discussion in the literature, in halachic literature, and in the literature of the later Jewish Bible commentaries. Okay, so the first phrase is, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as male slaves do. So, the first 6 verses of this chapter have described that a male slave works for 6 years, then he goes for free, and if he decides he's going to stay, he goes through a ceremony, and then he is a slave lit olam beyond that. Okay. According to Rashbam and other pshat-oriented people, that means forever. According to others, it means the Jubilee. And now this section begins by saying, Lo tetzei ketzei avadim. We'll get back to that phrase. Okay, let's just read through the whole text here. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, who designated her for himself. I think the way the rabbis understood this text is the only reasonable way to understand this text. It doesn't come right out and say it, but I think the common rabbinic understanding is the only way that I can think of to understand this, which is that when the man purchased this girl, the idea was that he would marry her. But if he decides that he doesn't want to marry her, he designated her for himself. Lo ye'ada. And ye'ud is a word that's often used in marriage context. So it's as if by this purchase price, he has said, I am going to marry this girl when she grows up a little bit. He buys her. The standard understanding is that there is a poor ancient Israelite who can't feed his family very well, and so he sells off his daughter. As cruel as that sounds, what it is he found somebody who's willing to give him some money right now, and then once his daughter grows up, he will marry this person. But what happens if after the purchaser makes this purchase, he decides, well, I'm not going to marry her. He must let her be redeemed. Beheftah. An opportunity should be given. This common understanding is there's an opportunity should be given to the family to retrieve her and to lower the purchase price and say, okay, if you give me back some of the money that I gave you, then I will return your daughter to you. And then the second troubling phrase that we will see the commentator struggling with reads, La'am nochri lo yimshol lemochra bevigdova. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders. It looks to me like JPS tried to, the Jewish Publication Society translation tried to tone down this text. Of course, the simplest understanding of nochri means non-Jews, non-Israelites. But they translated here as he shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders. We'll get back to this. Since he broke faith with her. Again, we'll talk about the difficulties involved in interpreting that phrase. And if he designated her for his son, he shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. So now they're saying that when this wealthy man purchased this girl, there could have been two goals that he had in mind. One of them was that he might marry her, and the other goal is that his son might marry her. And if he decides that his son is going to marry her, then he shall treat her kemishpat habanot, that even though she was purchased, in other words, it's as if the text is saying, don't think of her in the slave category, even though in the beginning it says when a man sells his daughter as a slave. What the possibilities are, there have been three possibilities mentioned so far: either that he'll marry her, or that he isn't pleased with her, so he allows her to be redeemed, or the third possibility is that his son will marry her. But if his son marries her, he shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. If he marries another, he must not withhold from this one her food, her clothing, or her ona. This is the third of the four phrases in this text that we will look at in some detail to try to figure out what it means. If he marries another, does this mean that the purchaser married another? Does this mean that the son married another? Either one of those is possible. He must not withhold from her food, her clothing, or her ona. And if he fails her in these three ways, then v'yatsa chinam ein kasev, she shall go free without payment. So in the end, the text is saying that she's not going to hang around there and be a slave forever. The resolution is either going to be that he marries her, or that his son marries her, or that he allows her family to purchase her back at a reduced price. And if none of those things happen, then v'yatsa chinam ein kasef, even though he's not getting any money back, she shall go free without payment. Okay, so that's the text, and those are the four different difficult phrases that appear in this text, and we're going to take them on one at a time. I'm not sure that we're going to get to all four of them today, but we'll do the best that we can. Issue number one. What does lo teitze ketzeta avadim? Reminding you again, it says, if a man sells his daughter as a slave, lo teitze ketzeta avadim, she shouldn't go free as male slaves do. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that the rules applying to her are more lenient or more stringent? Like, is this saying, she's not going to remain a slave like that male is going to remain a slave for 6 years before going free? Or is this saying, we said that the male slave will go free after 6 years, but that's not what's going to happen here. So somebody like Samuel David Lucato in the 19th century writes, it is self-evident that scripture is not imposing a stringency on the daughter, but is being lenient. For if 6 years elapse before she shows signs of puberty, she shall go forth free. That it's saying that there are many ways in which she shouldn't go free, just in the ways in which were described for the male slave. But the meaning, according to Shadal, of that phrase, she shall not go free as male slaves do, meaning there are many other ways in which she is going to go free. And Shadal accepts the rabbinic interpretation that this text is saying that the purchaser has the right to marry her or marry her off to his son only until she reaches the age of puberty. And if he's not interested in marrying her or having his son marry her when she reaches the age of puberty, he has to let her go, because she has to marry somebody. That's what happened in the ancient world, that girls got married around the age of puberty. So, and then Shadal says, but of course, if he had her there for 6 years before she reached the age of puberty, then of course she'd go free. Is Lucato saying this because of his modern 19th century values, or has he picked this up from his careful reading of the text? You can all decide on your own which one is happening here. And we'll see what other people have got to say about the subject. Rashi writes here, what does this mean? She shall serve either 6 years, or until the Jubilee year, or until she shows signs of incipient puberty. Whichever of these periods comes first brings her freedom first. And this is, Rashi is, as generally happens, Rashi is just offering the standard halachic understanding. That lo tetzei ketzei ta'avadim means she will be limited to the formula. There's only one formula that freed the male slave, which was that 6 years of service, but she has other phrases. Rashi realizes that you might understand the text differently. He says, or perhaps this is not so. But she shall not go free as male slaves do, means she shall not go free at the end of 6 years or at the Jubilee year, but only, he said, no, that couldn't be. And he cites another text to try to prove this. He realizes, Rashi has an excellent sense of how to read a text, and he looks at this text and he knows that it can be read in both directions. And so he acknowledges that you might be inclined to read the text as actually being more stringent on this on this girl, but he says, no, that's impossible. And what it is saying is that there are, in addition to going free after 6 years or going free after the Jubilee year, she also would go free when she reached puberty, because the whole idea was that she would get married, and if she's not marrying into this family, then she should be set free so that she can marry somebody else. So again, everybody can decide on their own whether this is really the pshat of the biblical text, but this is how the rabbis understood the text. And if you're just thinking again about the phrase here, before we see one more comment on the phrase, when man sells his daughter as a slave, she won't go free as male slaves do, but the following will happen. So Rashbam writes here, what does lo tetzei ketzeta avadim mean? Ella yikachenu lo liisha kemo shemefarish beholech. That's how, and I think this is you all know, I think most of you know, that I'm a big fan of Rashbam's Torah commentary, so maybe my supporting here of his interpretation is because of my bias in his favor. But I think that he's offering a good and legitimate reading of the text, saying, when it says in the previous section, when one purchases a male slave, he's going to remain a slave for 6 years or until the Jubilee year. And here it says, but this isn't what happens with the purchase of a female, because the purchase of the female is, the purpose of the purchase of the female is ela yikachena lo liisha. The idea is that the purchaser will take her as a wife, as the text continues to explain. And when you look at the continuation of the text, Rashbam is right. The text doesn't say anything about working or anything of that nature. It's all just talking about marriage. If he decides he doesn't want to marry her, and if he decides that her son's going to marry her, and if he marries her, it's all just about marriage. And so Rashbam says that lo tetzei ketzei ta'avadim means She should go free as male slaves do, but rather the whole goal is that the purchaser should take her as a wife. Okay, that's interpretive crux number one. What to do about the phrase lo tetzeh ketzet avadim. Maybe before I go on to interpretive crux number two, I'll just take a look at the chat and see how much influence the 3,000 years ago the tribal or clan leaders have over approving marriages or sales of women daughters. I don't think they have, though. I think these were probably private. Puberty likely occurred slightly later in the ancient world, and still, of course, it's early by our standards. Yes, Susanna, you're definitely right about that. Advisor spends money, marry in normal, bride's family provides dowry or not. It is very confusing to know which direction more money went when there was a wedding. But I think that my understanding of the text is that more money went from the groom's family to the bride's family in biblical times and biblical society. Any evidence that the slave wife becomes the hated wife? No, I don't know anybody who says that, but of course that could happen for sure. Okay, so that's interpretive crux number one, and now we go on to the next problem. La'am nochri lo yimshol lemochra bevigdova. Okay, so let's see that phrase again in context. A man sells his daughter as a slave. She shall not go free as male slaves do. If she proves to be displeasing to the master who designated for who's going to marry her, and she decided not to, then vehefta, he should let her be redeemed. He should provide a simple way for her to return to her family. La'am nochri lo yimshol lemochra bevigdo ba. He will not have the right to sell her to an am nochri since he broke faith with her. Does anybody want to write in the chat what's really troubling about this phrase? What is implied by the simplest reading of those words there? La'am nochri lo yimshol lemochra bevigdova. He's not allowed to sell her to an am nochri. A couple of people. Yes, so Zev writes to am nochri. Does that mean
it sounds like another nation? It doesn't sound to a non-Israelite nation, to someone, a buyer from a non-Israelite nation or a group. After all, Yosef wasn't sold to an individual. He was sold to a group, to a caravan.
Okay, possibly, but as Zev puts it here, the implication here, he's not allowed to sell her to an am nochri, but that implies that he is able to sell her to another Jew. And all of the commentators from Chazal on, from the Talmudic rabbis on, were really troubled by this idea, and they said this is impossible. We cannot understand the text in that way. And so, for example, okay, first of all, Rashbam says, if she proves to be displeasing and unattractive to her master such that he doesn't want to take her for his wife, then he shall not have the right to sell her bevigdo ba bevigdo, because he broke faith with her bagad. It doesn't have to do with beged. It has to do with breaking faith, with being treacherous, with being a traitor. He broke faith with her. And Rashbam points out that, in other words, since he broke faith with her by not taking her for his wife, breaking faith means failing to fulfill one's responsibility towards a wife or a potential wife as as it says in Malachi, the wife of your youth with whom you have broken faith, though she is your partner and covenanted spouse. So the phrase "leave God" appears a number of times in the Bible when a man is unfaithful to his wife, and even in modern Hebrew, adultery is referred to very often as bigida. So if he's not faithful to her, so the idea was that he was going to marry this girl, and then he broke faith with her, and so this is criticizing him. Rashbam is correctly pointing out that the text is using a fairly strong word here to criticize the man here who purchased her and then decided that he wasn't going to marry her. Rashi says, though, but then we get to the question of what does it mean that he can't sell her la'am nochri? Rashi says, la'am nochri lo yimshol lemochra, eino rashai lemochra le'acher. She cannot be sold to any other person. Lo ha'adon v'lo ha'av. Rashi is simply reflecting here the rabbinic understanding that this phrase here, he shall not have the right to sell her to an amnochri, means that a girl can be sold a maximum of one time. And after she is sold the first time, the purchaser does not have the right to sell her to somebody else.
Very good point.
As far as I know, the halachot, when somebody purchases a male Eved Ivri, he would be allowed to sell that Eved Ivri to somebody else. But the halacha says that a female who is purchased as a slave cannot be sold again. So Rashi just says, as he often does, he looks at these words here, la'am nochri lo yimshol lemochra, and it doesn't tell you how we get from those words to the halacha conclusion. He just gives you the halacha conclusion, which is, eino rashai lemochra la'acher lo ha'ador v'lo ha'av. She can never be sold again. The purchaser can't sell her again, and if she's returned to her father cannot sell her a second time. It's all over. What does Onkelos do? Onkelos writes here, Ligvar achoran later shoot lezabona. So this is the one of the oldest Jewish translations. I guess the Septuagint is a slightly older Jewish translation of the Torah. That's the translation into Greek. But the Onkelos is also an almost 2,000-year-old translation. And so what is how does Onkelos understand that phrase? Am nochri. He translates it as Gvar achoran, another man. Okay, that's much more palatable to say that it means another man instead of saying that it means a non-Israelite, which would imply you can't sell her to a non-Israelite, means that you can sell her to an Israelite. So Onkelos smooths this over by saying that he doesn't have the right to sell her to anybody else. That's am nochri means any other person. And it seems to me as if the JPS tried to make the text more palatable also by translating am nochri as outsiders, which conforms with the standard rabbinic understanding of this text.
Professor Lockshin?
Yes.
Is it possible to understand to mean kin, K-I-N, rather than nation? Because in plenty of other places, that's what the word am means. Like Yosef el Amav, Parshat Emor, it basically means that. Lo yitamei ba'al ba'amav.
Okay, we will see. Very good. Thank you. There are a number of people who attempt to suggest something very close to what you said. In fact, Shadal actually suggested that Am might mean Shevet, it might mean tribe, and there are a number of verses in the Bible where Am might mean might mean tribe. So that was his way around it. But what I want to look at with you right now is the interpretive acrobatics of Ibn Ezra, which explains a lot about how Ibn Ezra interpreted the Bible. So here's Ibn Ezra's commentary here. Unclus wrote that Am Nochri means another man. Saadia Gaon said that another example like this is when Abimelech says to God in Genesis chapter 20, he says to him, will you kill Hagoy gam tzadik taharog? Will you kill even a goy who is righteous? Now, of course, this doesn't look all that funny to us because in later Hebrew, the word goy started to mean an individual non-Jew. But in the Bible, goy means a people. And so here's a possibility. Saadia Gaon says that even though goy generally means a nation, Mika Amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz, who is like the Jewish people, one nation, that sometimes the word goy can be used about an individual also. And on these two Torah giants, the writer of foolishness based himself, allowing himself to emend biblical texts. Ibn Ezra often talks about somebody who he never identifies, and he calls him Hamahavil, the guy who writes foolishness, the guy who writes vanity, the guy who gives stupid interpretations of biblical texts. In his book about Ibn Ezra, Professor Uriel Simon, my neighbor in Jerusalem now, gives all the theories about who this might be, and he comes to the conclusion that he thinks that it is Jonah ibn Janach, the great grammarian who lived a number of years before Ibn Ezra, and who sometimes said, sometimes you look at a commentary and the commentator said, you see this word here? You should understand it as if it was written the following way. Is that emending the text, or is it saying, well, this is the best way of understanding it? So Ibn Janach did that, but Ibn Ezra thinks that he was proposing emendations of the biblical text, and then he says his book deserves to be burned.
Isn't it more likely it's a Kara'i? Because he wouldn't say that about Ibn Janach.
You should read the chapter in Uriel Simon's book on the subject. He offers some strong arguments. If we could keep the oral comments until the end, I'd appreciate it. He said, these Unclus and Saadia opened up the door for people to propose emendations. Okay. Ibn Ezra goes on and says, I am going to say as a principle, there are places in the Torah where our sages offered an interpretation that is really just a mnemonic device, an asmachta. They, of course, knew what the text really means. They had an oral tradition that a daughter could not be resold. Unclus translated here as a mnemonic device to remember that oral tradition. But the pshat conforms to the literal meaning. Okay, so in other words, I'm not going to get into emendation of text, and I'm also not going to stand on my head and say that means person and that goy means person. Neither of those things. I'm not going to accept either of those approaches. What I'm going to say is that when the rabbis said what they said, they weren't offering an interpretation of the biblical text. What they were doing was telling us the oral tradition. We have a Torah shebichtav and a Torah sheba'al peh. We have an oral Torah and a written Torah. And the rabbis wrote down what they learned through the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and what they learned through the Torah Sheba'al Peh is that a daughter could never be resold. And why did Unclus translate that way? He wasn't offering an interpretation. He was just telling you what he was just telling you what the rabbis learned through the Torah Sheba'al Peh. But the pshat conforms to the literal meaning. Upshuto kemashma'o. That you can't say that this is the interpretation of the verse. But wait a second, so what is the interpretation of the verse? Because the verse, just to recall, the verse seems to say, if he doesn't want to marry her, he shall not have the right to sell her to an Nochri, and that seems to imply that that means that he could sell her to another Jew. Okay, here's Ibn Ezra offering you what he considers to be the pshat. And this is the pshat meaning. You want to know what the pshat meaning of this verse? Here it is. An Israelite is allowed to sell himself as a slave either to another Israelite or to a resident alien. If you look carefully in the parsha that we read in Israel last week and that you will read in the diaspora this week, there is a reference to the possibility of an Israelite being a slave to another Israelite, or an Israelite being a slave to a non-Jew who is living in Eretz Yisrael. The text recognizes that possibility. And Ibn Ezra says that when an Israelite sells himself as a slave, he's allowed to sell himself either to another Israelite or to a resident alien. But he can sell his daughter only to another Israelite, but not to a foreigner. When it says, he shall not have the right to sell her to Nochri, this is referring to the father, the original seller. He has the right to sell her, but does not have the right to sell her to a foreigner, even though he has the right to sell himself to a foreigner. The phrase, La'am Nochri lo yimshol lo mochra, is the continuation of the phrase, when a man sells his daughter, even though it is not contiguous. Ve'im hu me'uchar. This is interpretive gymnastics that Ibn Ezra is doing here. And I've highlighted here in red what Ibn Ezra is saying here, that you're supposed to read together the first clause and the last clause. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, he shall not have the right to sell her to a non-Israelite. And it's as if, according to Ibn Ezra's understanding, all the stuff in black font in between is like an aside comment, a parenthetical comment. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, he shall not have the right to sell her to a non-Israelite. But when we mentioned, since they mentioned the idea of selling a daughter as a slave, they said, well, as an aside, she doesn't go free as male slaves do, but she's actually supposed to marry the guy, and that's what, or get returned to her family. So this is, I've always found this interesting, that Ibn Ezra, first of all, that of course that he considers the emendation kind of way of reading the text to be unthinkable, but he also finds, what Onkelos does here, Ligvara Choram Leitle Reshut L'Zabona, he shall not have the right to sell her to another man. He says that couldn't be interpretation, that couldn't be pshat, because pshat has to conform to the words. And Ibn Ezra says, yes, pshat has to conform to the words, but it doesn't have to conform to the standard syntax. That Ibn Ezra is willing to tolerate an explanation here that takes the first read phrase here and combines it with the second read phrase here and says that's the pshat. In the meantime, Ibn Ezra also introduced to us another concept that will be very important in his worldview and in the worldview of many other biblical commentators, the idea of asmachta, the idea that sometimes you look at an interpretation of a biblical text and you have to say to yourself, nah, that's not an interpretation. What it is the rabbis telling you what they learned through the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And that, you'll see the Talmud says, okay, here's what the word says, here's what the verse says, and here's what we learn from here. Even Ezra says, no. That sometimes those those interpretations are so far-fetched that we have to call them an asmachta, we have to call them a mnemonic device. And I want to give you one more example here of Ibn Ezra promoting this concept of seeing what the rabbis often write or sometimes write as being an asmachta. So here's what it says in the book of Numbers. If a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he doesn't have any daughters, you shall assign his property to his brothers. If he doesn't have any brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, so, we're talking about who are the closest relatives. The closest relatives are sons and daughters and brothers and uncles. But what happens if he doesn't have, his parents are dead, he doesn't have a son, he doesn't have a daughter, he doesn't have brothers, he doesn't have uncles. So the text says, you shall assign his property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. So what do we do? This is what we do in all legal systems that I know of. We look to see who the closest relative is, and children are considered to be very close relatives, parents, brothers, uncles, but everybody has some relative out there. And so, it's as if the Torah said, I've given you a pattern here. I've told you about sons, daughters, brothers, and uncles, and you can extrapolate from this. If a person doesn't have any sons, daughters, brothers, or uncles, they look and find whoever is the closest relative. So that's the clear shot of the biblical text. And then we get to the Gemara, and the Gemara says, and how do we know that a husband inherits his wife's estate? As the rabbis taught, she'ero refers to his wife, and thus we know that a husband inherits his wife's estate. Wait a second, the rabbis looked at this verse here and said that this is about husbands and wives suddenly. They say she'er, which is translated here as just a word for relative. The rabbi said, no, this is a reference to a wife. And before you get all excited that there might be something proto-feminist here, you'll see in the continuation that it definitely is not proto-feminist. Would we then say that she also inherits his estate? He said, oh, no. That is, the Gemara says, that is why the text says, v'yarashota, he inherits from her, she does not inherit from him. Again, looking back at the verse. So the verse said, it mentions a she'er, which the rabbis want us to believe means a spouse. And then it says, v'yarashota, and all of you who know a little bit of Hebrew know that the word ota could mean her and it could mean it. And the JPS translation here, of course, translates in the what seems to be the most reasonable, simple way that it means it. He shall inherit it, meaning the nachala, meaning the inheritance. And the Gemara says, no, bi'arash ota means the husband inherits the wife's estate if the wife predeceases him, but the Talmud says the woman does not inherit from the husband if the husband predeceases her. And this is the reason that the rabbis created the idea of the ketubah. The ketubah is a formula to ensure, even though in their understanding of Torah law, a wife does not inherit the estate of the husband if the husband predeceases her. I guess the idea was they wanted the estate to stay within the tribe, and there was concern that this woman might go and get married to somebody from some other tribe, whatever the reason for this. But once the rabbis came along, they instituted the idea of the ketubah, which insists that the first claim on the estate is the wife's claim on the estate. And the customs about ketubot over the years became so strong. The Tosfot wrote back in the 12th, 13th century that, how come we write amounts of money in the ketubah that the guy's never actually going to have? And so reading medieval responsive literature, you see that very often when a man died, his children got nothing, his wife got everything, because the ketubah insists that this is the first crack at the estate that the wife will get. And by the time the Tosfot are writing in Franco-Germany in the 12th, 13th century, they are writing sums of money in the ketubah that the man is never going to have, meaning that the rest of his family is not going to get anything, and meaning that his wife is going to be his only heir, which is generally what happens in most modern circles these days. That when a spouse dies, generally the entire estate goes to the surviving spouse, and only if there isn't a surviving spouse does it go to the children. There are other patterns, of course, about that, but I think that might be the most common pattern. But that's not what the Gemara says here. And curiously, like this reading of that text in Numbers is so far from the text, that so far from the simple meaning of the text, that even the Gemara, that very often offers not simple interpretations of biblical texts, writes here, "V'hakrai lav hachi kativi." They say that's not what the verse means. That, like, how are you offering that? And then the Gemara discusses it, but it sticks with it. It sticks to its guns, and it says that is the halacha. So along comes Ibn Ezra, and he says, "Let me say as a general principle that there are well-known places in the Torah which the rabbis made as asmachta, but they of course knew the true meaning. For example, the yarash ota. It was known through their tradition that a man inherits his wife's estate. The rabbis made a dirasha on this verse to this effect as a mnemonic device. They wanted that every time you went to shul and heard this section of the Torah being read, and you heard those words, the yarash ota, you would say to yourself, oh, that's how, that reminds me that when a woman dies, her husband inherits the estate. That was the rabbinic goal, not to interpret the text, but to take this oral tradition that they had and artificially combine it with the words of the text. The rabbis did not worry that someone might consider this the true meaning of the verse, since all of Israel knows the interpretation of the verse follows the simple sense and the plain meaning. You know, you just can't look at that verse and say that that verse means that the wife, when the wife dies, the husband inherits. It's to be assumed that anybody who knows how to read Hebrew will understand that that's not what the verse here said. And so what were the rabbis doing by offering this interpretation? This interpretation isn't an interpretation according to Ibn Ezra. It's simply offering a grounding, an artificial connection of a rabbinic tradition to a biblical verse. Okay, and perhaps I'll just mention one other thing about this this verse here. When Rashi explained this verse, his father had no brothers. You shall assign his property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. You know, when Rashi looked at this verse and looked at the two previous verses, so the previous verse, the two previous verses say, if he has no daughter, you shall assign his property to his brothers. And then it doesn't say, and they shall inherit it, the yarshu otah. And the next verse says, if he has no brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brothers. And it doesn't say, vehem yirshu otah. But then we get to the last clause here, and the last clause here says, if his father had no brothers, you shall assign his property to his nearest relatives in his own clan. And then, according to Rashi's kind of formula of how to understand the Torah, Rashi says to himself, there are two unnecessary words in this text, the yarash ota. If they weren't here, there would be nothing missing. if the text just said, that would be just like the previous verse and just like the verse before. And so why did it write dirasha? So using what the standard understanding of midrash halacha that Rashi uses, that there cannot be superfluous words in the text. Rashi says that the whole midrash here of the rabbis in Baba Batra was based on the fact that those two words, v'yarash ota, are redundant. They are not necessary. Ibn Ezra will have none of that. And Ibn Ezra will also have none of saying that that's actually what the verse here means on any sense of level of meaning of the word to mean. It can't mean that. And Ibn Ezra is saying that he is not an opponent of the rabbinic system, but he is an opponent of seeing what the Talmud said as being interpretation of the biblical text. It should be understood as the Talmud preserving the oral traditions of the Torah Shebe'al Peh. There are some people who think that Ibn Ezra might ultimately believe that it was the rabbis legislating as opposed to preserving oral traditions. I don't think so. I take him at his word. There are later Jewish commentators who say that when you find, later meaning in the 19th and 20th century, people who say that when you find the rabbis offering an interpretation that is so far from the plain meaning of the biblical text, it is a sign that the rabbis are legislating. That's not what Ibn Ezra, that's not Ibn Ezra's approach. Ibn Ezra's approach is when you find the rabbis offering an interpretation like this, that is so far from the simple interpretation of the text, it is a sign that they are attaching an oral tradition to the biblical text. Okay, we will stop here. We dealt with 2 of the 4 interpretive cruxes in this text. Somebody, let's see the questions that showed up here. Okay. Okay. To outsiders, does that mean he can resell her to other Jews? Yes, that is the problem. While his garment is on her, no, it doesn't really mean garment. It means bagad means to be treacherous. I understand these texts as more of a protection for the welfare of a daughter. It is harder for a woman to survive on her own in those times. Jolene writes, if she does not have the opportunity to marry, life will be harder for her. We should remember how much time and effort was required for a family unit to feed itself, that is, grow food and tend livestock. I agree. It still doesn't make me feel wonderful about this text, but it makes me feel a little better. Your explanation there, Jolene. Broke faith with her. So she is not only an object, Elsa would say break faith with her family. That's right. Yes, you're absolutely. So is her status elevated? She is seen as a person that you could treat properly, or that you could treat in a treacherous way. You could end up being treacherous to this person, and as Rashbam correctly does, he compares this passage to that moving passage against divorce in the prophet Malachi, where he talks about men who are treacherous to. Malachi is not interested in outlawing divorce, but he's not a fan of divorce. And it says when men forget about their first love, and it's an awful kind of thing. What is supposed to then happen to her? She, and also the person who made the last comment said, sell her only one time, it prevents prostitution 100%. That's right. So what happens to her? She goes back to her family. But Lauren says, isn't selling his daughter a type of prostitution? It does. From our perspective, it does seem that way. How does Ibn Ezra do with the Victo Ba? I think he might understand it the same way that Rashbam understood it. Although I'm sorry, no, because he connects it to the first clause. He says, if a man sells his daughter as a slave, then it's saying that when a man sells his daughter as a slave, he's been a traitor to his daughter. He's not treating her. He's not treating her properly. It ends up being in Ibn Ezra's reading. It ends up being a much more modern kind of understanding that Susanna correctly tells us to take a look at that. That if Ibn Ezra is saying that, then that means that the father is boged, is being treacherous to his daughter. Okay. It was wonderful seeing you all. We will continue with this text next week, and we'll deal with the last two interpretive cruxes of the text. And thank you for everybody who's saying thank you there on the chat. Thank you all for coming. Wonderful learning with you. And we'll learn together again next week if you can make it. And well, actually, I don't know. I think there's a halacha that says that at this point of time, since I haven't counted the day, I shouldn't mention what holiday is being observed here, because that might constitute me counting the Omer right now. So I'll just say, have a good celebration if you are celebrating, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
We have a great class coming up next week. Tomorrow is the time for Torah with Dr. Benny Gesundheit, and tomorrow as well, our Parshat HaShavua speaker is Shira Hakoler, and she's going to do a wonderful class on understanding Shemitah, a conceptual approach. So take a look at all the upcoming programs, and we hope to see everybody soon. Thanks for coming and learning with us today. Have a great day.